Picture this. A battle-scarred Roman centurion lies dying in a military hospital in Jerusalem. The year 73 CE, his weathered hands tremble as he grips the sleeve of a young scribe. "Write this down," he whispers, his voice barely audible above the moaning of other wounded soldiers. "The Empire must know the truth about what we really did at Masada." "Okay." The scribe hesitates, stylus hovering over his wax tablet. Born in a small village outside Rome to a family of modest means, Marcus had joined the legions at 18. He'd marched through Britain's fog-shrouded forests, hunting Celtic warriors who melted away like ghosts. In gambling, Marcus could be found reading Greek philosophy or debating ethics with the legion's medical staff. Hay kept a journal, unusual for a centurion. Hay, where he recorded not just military movements, but his thoughts about the nature of duty, honor, and the price of empire. His men respected him, not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his fairness. The great Jewish revolt, which had begun 6 years earlier, was finally nearing its end. Jerusalem had fallen, the Second Temple lay in ruins, and hundreds of thousands of Jews had been killed or enslaved. But one last stronghold remained: Masada, an ancient fortress perched on a mesa in the Judean desert, nearly 1,400 feet above the Dead Sea. Silva had been given explicit orders from Rome. This siege was to be more than a military victory. It was to be a demonstration of Roman power, so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it would crush the spirit of potential rebels throughout the empire for generations. Unlike many Roman officers, Marcus never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Support personnel who would participate in what would become one of the most famous sieges in history. But, as he would later reveal in his deathbed confession, the official history of the Masada siege, the version that would be taught in schools and celebrated in monuments, was a carefully constructed lie. The empire's seemingly invincible legions weren't just successful because of their discipline, their equipment, or their tactics. It included detailed schedules for psychological operations, when to allow hope to flourish among the besieged, and when to crush it completely. It even contained what can only be described as early forms of propaganda warfare, detailing how to spread rumors and disinformation that would create paranoia and division within enemy ranks. They were successful because they had perfected the art of psychological warfare to a degree that their enemies never understood. It described training methods that would allow ordinary men to commit acts of calculated cruelty while maintaining their sense of honor and duty. He was a practitioner of the world's first systematic program of psychological warfare, and he had been for years without even knowing it. It was a manual for creating the perfect psychological warrior, a soldier who could break human beings as efficiently as he could break enemy formations. The legions established their camps, built their fortifications, and began the methodical process of isolating the fortress from the outside world. The message was clear. Rome was not just besieging Masada. Rome was claiming the very desert as its own. The defenders were not just outnumbered, they were cosmically insignificant. They released half of them, providing them with food and safe passage to Egypt. The defenders had seen mercy. They knew it was possible, but they also knew that it came at the price of absolute submission. The psychological pressure was designed to create internal conflict within the fortress, to make the defenders question whether continued resistance was worth the cost. The other half were crucified in full view of the fortress walls. The message was clear. Rome could be merciful, but mercy was entirely at Rome's discretion. But as Marcus would later reveal, what appeared to be standard military procedure was actually the opening phase of a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign. Marcus wrote that on the 10th day of the siege, the Romans began what the secret doctrine called selective mercy operations. A small group of Jewish prisoners, captured during the march to Masada, were brought to the base of the fortress under a flag of truce. Roman officers announced that these prisoners would be freed if the defenders surrendered immediately. He'd stood in the scorching deserts of Syria, where the sun could kill a man as surely as any enemy blade. A soldier's soldier, a thinking man's warrior. A leader who understood that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the darkness within ourselves. This was unjust about showing the enemy that resistance was futile. It was about creating a sense of cosmic inevitability. The Romans didn't just surround Masada, they transformed the entire landscape around it into a monument to imperial power. By the time he reached the rank of centurion, Marcus had killed more men than he could count. But this wasn't just about logistics. Every aspect of the Roman camps was designed to send a psychological message to the defenders above. The camps were laid out in perfect geometric patterns that could be seen from the fortress walls. The legions conducted elaborate military drills in full view of the besieged, their movements synchronized with mathematical precision. It was called the Doctrina Arcana, the secret doctrine, and it contained psychological manipulation techniques that the Roman military had been developing and refining for over a century. The document wasn't just about winning battles. It was about breaking the human spirit so completely that entire populations would surrender their will to resist. And he'd done it all in service to Rome's vision of civilized order. It detailed how to exploit a besieged population's growing desperation, how to turn their own values against them, and how to make surrender seem not just inevitable, but desirable. Drawn by the promise of steady pay, Roman citizenship, and the chance to serve the greatest empire the world had ever known. After all, fewer than 1,000 men, women, and children had taken refuge there, led by a charismatic zealot named Eleazar ben Jair. They weren't just planning to defeat the rebels at Masada. They were planning to use the siege as a testing ground for psychological warfare techniques that would become the foundation of Roman military doctrine for centuries to come. They were surrounded by the most powerful military force in the world, cut off from supplies, and facing inevitable defeat. It should have been over in weeks. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He earned his rank through 25 years of brutal campaigns across the empire's bloodiest frontiers. He knows that what he's about to record could destroy everything Romans believe about their greatest military victory. But the centurion's grip tightens, and his eyes burn with the intensity of a man who has carried a terrible secret for too long. "Write it," he commands. "Before I die, someone must know." What this dying soldier revealed in his final hours would remain buried in the archives for nearly 2,000 years. But when archaeologists finally uncovered his confession in 1963, hidden beneath the ruins of a Roman fort near the Dead Sea, it changed everything we thought we knew about Rome's military machine. This isn't just another story about ancient warfare. This is about the moment when the mask slipped, when the empire's greatest propaganda victory was exposed as its most shameful secret, and when one man's conscience finally overcame a lifetime of military conditioning. Who was this man? His name was Marcus Flavius Tertius, and before that final confession, he was exactly what every Roman citizen aspired to be. Marcus had fought in Germania, where he'd watched entire villages burn to ash. But Marcus was also a man of contradictions. While his fellow soldiers spent their off-duty hours drinking, this was the man who would eventually become the keeper of Rome's most dangerous secret. The Masada Campaign. The year was 72 CE, and the Roman Empire was facing its most humiliating military challenge in decades. To most Romans, Masada should have been a footnote in their glorious victory over the Jewish rebels. But as Marcus Flavius Tertius would later write in his confession, Rome's military leadership had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The campaign was commanded by Flavius Silva, a general known for his methodical approach to warfare and his absolute loyalty to Emperor Vespasian. Marcus arrived at Masada in the autumn of 72 CE as part of the 10th Legion, one of nearly 15,000 Roman soldiers. The secret doctrine, Rome's hidden weapon. What Marcus discovered at Masada would shake his faith in everything he had believed about Roman military superiority. In his confession, Marcus described a document that was shown to senior officers on the first day of the siege. The Doctrina Arcana outlined what Roman military psychologists, yes, they had military psychologists nearly 2,000 years ago, had identified as the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human mind under extreme stress. Marcus wrote that the document contained diagrams showing the optimal placement of crucifixion stakes to maximize psychological impact on defenders. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the secret doctrine outlined how Roman soldiers were to be conditioned to carry out these psychological operations without question. Marcus realized that he wasn't just a centurion in the Roman army. The siege begins. The siege of Masada began like any other Roman military operation. The first element of the secret doctrine was what Roman military theorists called overwhelming presence. Marcus described how engineers worked round the clock to create what appeared to be a small Roman city in the desert. At night, the Romans lit thousands of torches and braziers, creating a constellation of lights that stretched for miles around the fortress. The real psychological warfare was yet to come. The defenders refused, as the Romans had expected. But instead of simply executing the prisoners, the Romans did something far more calculated. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about creating what Roman military psychologists called controlled hope. The ramp. Engineering despair, the most famous aspect of the Masada siege was the construction of the great ramp that allowed Roman forces to breach the fortress walls. Traditional histories present this as a remarkable feat of engineering, which it certainly was. But Marcus's confession revealed that the ramp was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical one. The secret doctrine had identified what Roman theorists called the architecture of despair. This was the idea that the way an enemy's defeat was achieved was as important as the defeat itself. The Romans could have built their siege works at night or behind screens to prevent the defenders from seeing their progress. They wanted the defenders to live with the knowledge of their approaching doom for as long as possible, to give despair time to take root and grow. The ramp wasn't just being built to breach the walls, it was being built to break the spirits of everyone inside those walls. Instead, they deliberately constructed the ramp in full view of the fortress. Every day, the defenders could measure their remaining time by the ramp's steady progress up the side of the mountain. He was a career soldier who had always taken pride in Roman military excellence. But what he was witnessing at Masada felt different from any campaign he had ever participated in. A young Jewish fighter named David had been captured during a night raid on the Roman camps. They treated David's wounds, fed him well, and had Marcus engage him in philosophical discussions about the nature of duty and survival. Over the course of several days, they convinced David that the situation was hopeless, that continued resistance would only lead to needless suffering. But what truly broke his heart was the realization that David genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. The psychological manipulation had been so complete that David thought he was showing mercy to his fellow defenders by helping to end their suffering quickly, and that the most compassionate thing he could do was help end the siege quickly. The mass suicide at Masada wasn't a spontaneous act of desperate courage. They knew that these were people who valued honor and religious purity above life itself. Silva revealed that the Romans had been intercepting communications from inside the fortress for weeks, and they knew that the defenders were planning mass suicide. But instead of trying to prevent it, Silva had decided to allow it to happen. They knew that the prospect of slavery, rape, and forced conversion would be more terrifying to the defenders than death. The story of Masada would become a cautionary tale about the futility of resistance to Roman power. Future potential rebels would think twice before defying the empire, knowing that even the most heroic resistance would ultimately end in death and defeat. When the legions finally breached the fortress walls, they found a scene of devastation that would echo through history. Many of these were hardened veterans who had seen countless battlefields, but the sight of the mass suicide affected them profoundly. Some wept openly, others vomited, Few simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Families had died together, parents killing their children before taking their own lives. So legions prepared to march back to their permanent bases. He overheard conversations between officers that revealed how the Masada model would be applied to future campaigns. It was about creating a system of psychological control that would make the Empire's subjects compliant and docile. The goal wasn't just to defeat Rome's enemies. It was to make them defeat themselves. And Marcus realized that he had been participating in this system his entire career, even when he thought he was just following orders and doing his duty. The psychological warfare techniques that had been tested in the Judean desert would be refined and exported to every corner of the empire. Marcus described how General Silva and his senior staff walked through the fortress making careful notes, studying the psychological effectiveness of their campaign. Women and children who had hidden in the fortress's cisterns and emerged to tell the tale. The psychological warfare campaign had been designed not to break the defenders' will to resist, but to channel their resistance into a form that would serve Roman propaganda purposes. It was the intended outcome of the psychological warfare campaign that the Romans had been waging for months. The secret doctrine had predicted that the defenders would choose death over surrender, and the entire siege had been designed to make that choice seem inevitable. Under interrogation, David had revealed that he had a sister among the defenders, and that he was one of the few people in the fortress who knew about secret water sources that were keeping the defenders alive longer than the Romans had expected. The Romans had been subtly encouraging the mass suicide through their psychological operations. The false intelligence that David had carried back to the fortress had not just been about poisoning water sources. It had also included carefully crafted rumors about Roman intentions for the prisoners. Rumors designed to make surrender seem like a fate worse than death. The poison would unkill the defenders immediately. It would make them sick enough to weaken their resistance, but not sick enough to die quickly. The Romans had manipulated nearly 1,000 people into killing themselves. And they had done it so skillfully that their victims had believed they were choosing honor over shame. The goal was to create a medical crisis that would force the defenders to surrender to obtain Roman medical treatment. These were missions designed to gather information about conditions inside the fortress, but they were also intended to spread disinformation and create paranoia among the defenders. They would capture individual defenders during sorties, then use a combination of torture and psychological manipulation to turn them into double agents. These turned defenders would then be allowed to escape back to the fortress, where they would spread carefully crafted rumors designed to undermine morale and create suspicion. But according to Marcus's confession, what happened next was not what traditional histories have recorded. The official Roman account claims that the defenders, led by Eleazar ben Jair, chose mass suicide rather than surrender to Roman slavery. Nearly 1,000 men, women, and children died by their own hands, leaving only a handful of survivors to tell the tale. The systematic psychological torture of the defenders went beyond anything he had been trained to expect. It challenged his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a Roman soldier. The Romans could have simply waited for the defenders to run out of water or food, a strategy that would have been far less costly in terms of Roman lives and resources, but that wouldn't have achieved the psychological objectives that the siege was really designed to accomplish. Marcus wrote that the ramp was built using a combination of Roman engineering expertise and Jewish slave labor. But the slaves weren't just any captured Jews. They were people who had been identified as having connections to the Masada defenders. They faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to stop the construction by shooting arrows at the workers, which would mean killing their own relatives and friends, or they could watch helplessly as their doom was literally constructed before their eyes. Some were relatives of the besieged, others were former neighbors or friends. The Romans forced these slaves to build the very instrument of their loved ones' destruction. The psychological impact on the Masada defenders was devastating. Every day, they could see their own people laboring to create the means of their defeat. But the true genius of the ramp from a psychological warfare perspective was its visibility. Marcus described how Roman engineers calculated not just the optimal angle and construction materials for the ramp, but also the optimal psychological pace of construction. The betrayal. As the siege progressed, Marcus found himself struggling with a growing sense of unease. Marcus wrote that his crisis of conscience began when he was assigned to oversee what the secret doctrine called intelligence infiltration operations. The Romans had developed techniques for inserting agents into besieged fortresses using methods that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Marcus described one particular operation that haunted him for the rest of his life. Instead of simply extracting this information through torture, the Romans implemented what the secret doctrine called empathetic manipulation. David agreed to return to the fortress with false information about Roman weaknesses and a plan to poison the secret water sources. Marcus wrote that he felt sick as he watched David climb back up to the fortress, carrying the instruments of his own people's destruction. The final assault. The ramp was completed in the spring of 73 CE, and the final assault on Masada began. Marcus revealed that this account was partially true, but it obscured the most important part of the story. The Romans had studied the psychology of the Jewish zealots extensively. Marcus wrote that on the morning of the final assault, he was part of a small group of officers who met with General Silva to discuss the day's operations. The general explained that a mass suicide would serve Roman interests better than a conventional victory. Dead martyrs were less dangerous than living rebels. But Silva also revealed something that Marcus found even more disturbing. Marcus realized that he hadn't just participated in a siege. He had participated in a mass murder disguised as a military victory. The aftermath. The siege of Masada ended exactly as the Roman psychological warfare experts had predicted. Marcus wrote that the Roman soldiers who entered the fortress were not prepared for what they found, but the officers' reaction was very different. The data collected at Masada would be analyzed by Roman military psychologists and incorporated into future versions of the secret doctrine. Marcus wrote that he began to understand the true scope of what he had participated in during the weeks following the siege. The secret doctrine wasn't just about winning individual battles or sieges. The months following the Masada siege were the darkest period of Marcus's life. He had always been a soldier who took pride in Roman military excellence, but now he understood that excellence in a very different light. The Roman legions weren't just superior because of their training, equipment, or tactics. They were superior because they had systematically studied how to break the human spirit, and they had turned that knowledge into a weapon of conquest. Marcus wrote that he began to see the secret doctrine at work in every aspect of Roman military operations. The way prisoners were interrogated, the way occupied territories were administered, the way potential rebels were identified and neutralized. All of it was part of a comprehensive system of psychological control that most Romans, including most Roman soldiers, never fully understood. He described how the knowledge of the secret doctrine was compartmentalized within the Roman military hierarchy. Most soldiers carried out their orders without understanding the psychological purpose behind them. Even many officers only understood their small part of the larger psychological warfare campaign. Only a select few at the highest levels had access to the complete doctrine, and they were bound by the most sacred military oaths to keep its contents secret. Marcus found himself in the terrible position of being one of the few people who understood the true nature of Rome's military success, but who lacked the power to do anything about it. He was trapped between his loyalty to the empire that had given him purpose and identity, and his growing horror at what that empire was actually doing to achieve its goals. He wrote about sleepless nights spent staring at the stars, wondering how many other glorious victories in Roman history had actually been carefully orchestrated psychological operations. How many enemy commanders had been manipulated into making decisions that seemed like brave last stands, but were actually playing into Roman hands? How many populations have been convinced to surrender not through force of arms, but through psychological manipulation so subtle that they never realized they were being controlled? The weight of this knowledge began to affect Marcus's ability to function as a soldier. He found himself hesitating before giving orders, questioning whether his commands were serving a legitimate military purpose or just advancing Rome's psychological warfare agenda. His fellow officers noticed his changed behavior, and some began to question his loyalty and reliability. Marcus realized that he was facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could continue to serve Rome while carrying the burden of his knowledge in silence, or he could find a way to expose the truth about that secret doctrine, knowing that doing so would almost certainly cost him his life and might not change anything. The decision. Marcus spent nearly a year wrestling with his crisis of conscience before he finally made his decision. He would continue to serve Rome outwardly, but he would also begin documenting everything he knew about the secret doctrine. He couldn't stop the psychological warfare machine that the empire had created, but he could ensure that someday someone would understand what had really happened. He began keeping a second journal, hidden separately from his official military records. In this secret journal, he documented every psychological warfare operation he witnessed or participated in. He described the techniques used, the rationale behind them, and their effects on both enemies and Roman soldiers. He wrote about the human cost of Rome's psychological superiority, and he tried to preserve the dignity of the people who had been manipulated and destroyed by Roman psychological operations. Marcus also began to realize that he was the only Roman soldier who was struggling with these moral questions. As he became more observant, he noticed signs that other officers were also uncomfortable with some of the psychological warfare techniques they were required to implement. There were subtle signs of dissent within the Roman military hierarchy, not treasonous rebellion, but quiet moral resistance to the more extreme applications of the secret doctrine. He wrote about conversations with other centurions who expressed doubts about the ethics of psychological manipulation. He described how some officers found ways to minimize the psychological impact of their operations without technically disobeying orders. There was a quiet network of Roman soldiers who were trying to maintain their honor and humanity while serving an empire that seemed increasingly willing to sacrifice both in pursuit of psychological dominance. But Marcus also realized that this quiet resistance was having little effect on the overall system. The secret doctrine was too deeply embedded in Roman military culture, and too many people benefited from its success for individual acts of conscience to make a significant difference. If anything meaningful was going to change, it would require a much more dramatic revelation of the truth. Marcus began to consider the possibility that he might be able to expose the secret doctrine through official channels. Perhaps if he could present his concerns to the right people in the military hierarchy, if he could convince them that the psychological warfare program was ultimately harmful to Rome's long-term interests. He spent months trying to identify potential allies among the senior officers, looking for people who might be willing to listen to his concerns. But the more he learned about how the secret doctrine was implemented and controlled, the more he realized that reform from within was probably impossible. The psychological warfare program wasn't just a military tool. It was a fundamental part of how the Roman Empire maintained its power. So many people had too much invested in the system for it to be changed by the complaints of a single centurion. It's a final campaign. Marcus's final opportunity to act on his conscience came in 73 CE, when he was assigned to a campaign in northern Judea designed to eliminate the last pockets of Jewish resistance. This was intended to be a cleanup operation, using the psychological warfare techniques perfected at Masada to quickly break the will of the remaining rebels. But Marcus discovered that this campaign was also serving as a training ground for a new generation of Roman officers who would export the secret doctrine to other parts of the empire. The northern Judea operations were being used to train psychological warfare specialists who would then be assigned to campaigns in Germania, Britain, and other frontier provinces. Marcus realized that he was witnessing the systematic expansion of the secret doctrine throughout the Roman military. What had been tested at Masada was now being institutionalized as standard Roman military practice. Within a few years, psychological warfare techniques would be embedded in every Roman campaign, and the empire's psychological dominance would be complete. He also learned that the secret doctrine was being adapted for use in civilian administration. Roman governors were being trained in psychological manipulation techniques that would help them control provincial populations without resorting to expensive military force. The goal was to create a system of psychological control that would make the empire's subjects police themselves. Marcus wrote that this revelation finally convinced him that he had to act. He could end to continue to participate in the expansion of the secret doctrine while knowing what it really was. But he also could unsimply desert or refuse orders without betraying his oath to Rome and his duty to his soldiers. He decided on a compromise that would allow him to maintain his honor while also serving his conscience. He would continue to serve Rome faithfully, but he would also ensure that his secret journal reached people who could use it to understand and potentially counteract the secret doctrine. He began making arrangements to have his journal hidden in a place where it might someday be discovered by future generations. Marcus also decided that if he ever had the opportunity to make a final statement about what he had witnessed, he would take it. He hoped that his words might serve as a warning to future generations about the dangers of psychological warfare and about the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the service of a great cause. The confession. Marcus's opportunity to make his final statement came sooner than he expected. In late 73 CE, during a minor skirmish with Jewish rebels, he was severely wounded by a spear thrust that punctured his lung and damaged his internal organs. The Roman military surgeons managed to keep him alive for several days, but they knew that his injuries were fatal. As Marcus lay dying in the military hospital, he found himself thinking about all the people whose lives had been destroyed by the secret doctrine. He thought about the defenders of Masada, who had been manipulated into killing themselves. He thought about the Jewish prisoners who had been turned into unwitting agents of their own people's destruction. He thought about the Roman soldiers who had been trained to commit acts of psychological cruelty without understanding what they were really doing. Marcus realized that he had one last chance to break the silence that surrounded the secret doctrine. He was dying, which meant that he was beyond the reach of Roman military discipline. His oath of secrecy would die with him, which meant that he could speak freely about what he had witnessed. And there was a young scribe in the hospital who had been assigned to record the final words of dying soldiers for their families. Marcus called the scribe to his bedside and told him that he had something important to confess. He explained that what he was about to reveal was not intended for his family or for the official military records. Instead, he wanted his confession to be hidden away, preserved for future generations who might be able to understand and learn from what he had witnessed. The scribe, whose name was Lucius, was initially reluctant to record a confession that contradicted official Roman history. But Marcus was persuasive, and he convinced Lucius that the truth about the secret doctrine was too important to be lost. He also revealed that he had left clues in his official military records that would help future researchers understand the scope of the psychological warfare program. Over the course of 3 days, Marcus told Lucius everything he knew about the secret doctrine. He described the psychological warfare techniques that had been used at Masada and in other campaigns. He complained how the Roman military had systematically studied and exploited human psychological vulnerabilities. He revealed the names of officers who had been involved in developing and implementing the psychological warfare program. The hidden truth. Marcus's confession revealed details about Roman psychological warfare that modern historians are still trying to fully understand. He described techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for their time, and that in some cases anticipated methods that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century. One of the most disturbing revelations in Marcus's confession was the extent to which the Roman military had studied the psychology of their own soldiers. The secret doctrine wasn't just about manipulating enemies, it was also about controlling Roman soldiers to ensure that they would carry out psychological warfare operations without question. Marcus described training methods that were designed to gradually desensitize soldiers to the psychological impact of their actions. New recruits were initially assigned to relatively minor psychological operations, such as spreading rumors or displaying captured enemy weapons in intimidating ways. As they became more comfortable with these activities, they were gradually exposed to more extreme psychological warfare techniques. The goal was to create soldiers who could implement psychological warfare operations while maintaining their sense of honor and duty. The Romans had realized that if soldiers understood the full psychological impact of their actions, many would refuse to carry them out. So they developed methods for compartmentalizing knowledge and responsibility, ensuring that most soldiers only understood their small part of the larger psychological warfare campaign. Marcus also revealed that the Roman military had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and neutralizing potential dissent within their own ranks. Soldiers who showed signs of moral resistance to psychological warfare operations were carefully monitored, and those who were considered unreliable were transferred to positions where they couldn't interfere with psychological operations. The confession described a Roman military that was far more psychologically sophisticated than most historians had previously believed. The legions weren't just disciplined fighting forces, they were carefully controlled psychological warfare machines, designed to break the spirit of Rome as enemies while maintaining the loyalty and effectiveness of Roman soldiers. Marcus's revelations also shed new light on how the Roman Empire maintained control over its vast territories. The psychological warfare techniques that were developed for military campaigns were adapted for civilian administration, creating a system of psychological control that made military force less necessary. Provincial populations were subtly manipulated to police themselves, reducing the cost of imperial administration while increasing the effectiveness of Roman control. The cover-up, Marcus's confession, was too dangerous to be allowed to survive in its original form. The scribe, Lucius, understood that recording such explosive information would put his own life at risk, and he took precautions to ensure that the confession could be preserved, while remaining hidden from Roman authorities. Lucius created multiple copies of the confession, but he disguised them as routine military correspondence. He embedded Marcus's revelations about the secret doctrine within fake reports about supply shortages, personnel transfers, and other mundane military matters. To anyone who didn't know what to look for, the documents would appear to be nothing more than boring administrative paperwork. But Lucius also knew that even disguised documents would eventually be discovered if they remained in official military archives. So he arranged for the confession to be hidden in multiple locations, including some that were outside the normal reach of Roman military authorities. He hid copies in private houses, in religious buildings, and even in the ruins of abandoned settlements. The confession that was discovered by archaeologists in 1963 was one of these hidden copies. It had been sealed in a pottery jar and buried beneath the floor of a building that had been destroyed during the Jewish revolt. The dry desert climate had preserved the documents remarkably well, allowing modern researchers to read Marcus's words nearly 2,000 years after they were written. But Marcus's confession also revealed why the truth about the secret doctrine had remained hidden for so long. The psychological warfare program wasn't just a military tool, it was a fundamental part of how the Roman Empire maintained its power. Revealing the truth about Roman psychological warfare techniques would have undermined the empire's authority and potentially sparked rebellions throughout the Roman world. The Roman military and political leadership had every incentive to keep the secret doctrine hidden, and they had the power to suppress any information that might compromise their psychological warfare capabilities. Marcus's confession survived only because Lucius had been clever enough to hide it effectively, and because the Roman authorities had been too focused on other threats to conduct a thorough search for hidden documents. The confession also revealed that Marcus was the only Roman soldier who had tried to expose the truth about the secret doctrine. There had been other attempts to reveal the psychological warfare program, but most had been quickly suppressed by Roman authorities. Marcus's confession survived because he had been smart enough to work with someone who understood how to hide information effectively. It's a modern discovery. The discovery of Marcus's confession in 1963 was initially dismissed by many historians as either a forgery or a work of fiction. The psychological warfare techniques described in the confession seemed too sophisticated for the ancient world, and the level of systematic psychological manipulation that Marcus described seemed inconsistent with traditional understanding of Roman military methods. But as archaeologists and historians began to examine the confession more carefully, they found corroborating evidence that suggested Marcus's account was genuine. Excavations in Masada and other Roman military sites revealed artifacts and architectural features that were consistent with psychological warfare techniques described in the confession. Modern psychological warfare experts were also consulted about the techniques described in Marcus's confession. They confirmed that the methods were not only plausible, but were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Some of the psychological principles described in the secret doctrine would not be formally recognized by modern psychology until the 20th century. The discovery of Marcus's confession also led to a re-examination of other historical sources about Roman military operations. Historians began to notice subtle references to psychological warfare techniques in official Roman histories, references that had been overlooked or misunderstood by earlier scholars. For example, the Roman historian Josephus had described some of the psychological aspects of the Masada siege, but his account had been dismissed as propaganda or literary embellishment. Marcus's confession suggested that Josephus had actually been describing real psychological warfare operations, but in a way that disguised their true nature. The confession also explained some puzzling aspects of Roman military success that had never been fully understood by historians. The speed with which Roman legions could pacify conquered territories, the loyalty of Roman auxiliary troops, and the effectiveness of Roman administration in diverse cultural settings all made more sense when viewed through the lens of systematic psychological warfare. Modern military historians began to realize that the Roman Empire's success was not just due to military superiority or administrative efficiency. The Romans had developed psychological warfare techniques that were centuries ahead of their time, and these techniques had been a crucial factor in their ability to conquer and control such a vast empire. The implications. The discovery of Marcus's confession has forced historians to reconsider many assumptions about the ancient world and about the nature of military and political power. The revelation that the Romans had developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques suggests that ancient societies were capable of much more complex social and political manipulation than previously believed. The confession also raises disturbing questions about how many other heroic last stands in ancient history were actually the result of psychological manipulation rather than genuine choices made by desperate defenders. If the Romans could manipulate the defenders of Masada into choosing mass suicide, what other famous defeats in ancient history were actually carefully orchestrated psychological operations? Marcus's revelations suggest that we need to re-examine the entire narrative of Roman expansion and conquest. The traditional story of Roman military superiority based on discipline, training, and tactical innovation may be incomplete. The Romans may have been successful primarily because they understood human psychology better than their enemies, and because they were willing to use that understanding as a weapon of conquest. The psychological warfare techniques described in Marcus's confession also have troubling parallels with modern propaganda and psychological manipulation methods. is the Romans' systematic study of human psychological vulnerabilities, their methods for breaking enemy morale, and their techniques for controlling their own soldiers. All anticipate methods that will be developed and refined by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. This suggests that the development of psychological warfare as a tool of political control has much deeper historical roots than most people realize. The Romans weren't just building roads and aqueducts, okay? They were also developing the intellectual and practical foundations for modern psychological manipulation techniques. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus's confession reveals the moral cost of psychological warfare, both for its victims and for the people who implement it. Marcus's struggle with his conscience shows that even in the ancient world, there were people who recognized the ethical problems with systematic psychological manipulation and who tried to resist it. The legacy. The impact of Marcus's confession on our understanding of Roman history has been profound, but its implications extend far beyond ancient history. The revelation that the Romans had developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques has forced modern military and political leaders to reconsider their own methods and assumptions. Military historians have begun to study the secret doctrine as an early example of systematic psychological operations. The techniques described in Marcus's confession have been analyzed by modern psychological warfare experts, and some have been found to be remarkably effective, even by contemporary standards. This has led to renewed interest in the psychological aspects of military operations and in the ethical questions surrounding psychological warfare. The confession has also influenced our understanding of how empires maintain control over diverse populations. The Romans' ability to govern such a vast and culturally diverse empire has always been one of the great puzzles of ancient history, but Marcus's revelations suggest that psychological manipulation may have been a crucial factor in Roman administrative success. Modern political scientists have noted similarities between Roman psychological warfare techniques and contemporary propaganda methods. The Romans' understanding of how to manipulate public opinion, how to create compliance without coercion, and how to make people police themselves all have clear parallels in modern political and social control techniques. This has led to uncomfortable questions about the extent to which modern democratic societies use psychological manipulation to maintain social order. If the Romans could develop such sophisticated psychological control techniques 2,000 years ago, what capabilities do modern governments have, and how are they being used? The confession has also had a significant impact on archaeological and historical research methods. Historians have become more skeptical of official sources and more interested in finding alternative perspectives on historical events. The discovery that such an important historical document could remain hidden for nearly 2,000 years has encouraged researchers to look more carefully for other hidden or suppressed sources. Marcus's confession has also influenced modern military training and ethics. The revelation that Roman soldiers were systematically conditioned to carry out psychological warfare operations without understanding their full implications has led to discussions about the importance of moral education in military training and about the responsibility of individual soldiers to stand the ethical implications of their actions. It's the personal cost. Throughout this story, we've focused on the historical and political implications of Marcus's confession. But it's important to remember that at its heart, this is a deeply personal story about one man's struggle with his conscience. Marcus wasn't a historian or a political theorist. He was a career soldier who found himself forced to confront the moral implications of his life's work. Marcus's confession reveals the tremendous personal cost of his decision to speak out about the secret doctrine. He had spent his entire adult life serving Rome, and he had built his identity around being a loyal and effective Roman soldier. Discovering that his military service had been built on systematic psychological manipulation of both enemies and allies was devastating to his sense of self. The confession shows that Marcus struggled with feelings of guilt and betrayal long before he was wounded. He felt guilty about his role in the psychological warfare operations he had participated in. but he also felt like he was betraying his fellow soldiers and his oath to Rome by questioning the methods that had made them successful. Cade's decision to make his confession was not easy or simple. He spent months wrestling with the question of whether he had the right to expose military secrets, even if those secrets involved unethical practices. He was torn between his loyalty to Rome and his loyalty to his own moral principles. But Marcus's confession also reveals his hope that future generations might learn from his experience. He wasn't just trying to expose the secret doctrine, he was trying to warn people about the dangers of psychological warfare and about the importance of maintaining moral principles, even in the service of a great cause. The confession shows that Marcus understood that his revelations might not change anything in the short term. The Roman Empire was too powerful and the secret doctrine too deeply embedded in Roman military culture for one dying soldier's words to make an immediate difference. But he hoped that someday, when people were ready to hear the truth, his words might help them understand the real cost of psychological warfare. Marcus's story is ultimately about the courage required to speak truth to power, even when that truth is dangerous, and when speaking, it requires great personal sacrifice. His confession represents one man's attempt to maintain his moral integrity in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure to remain silent. A broader pattern. Marcus's confession about the secret doctrine reveals that the Roman Empire was not just a military and political entity, but also a sophisticated psychological control system. The techniques that were developed for military campaigns were adapted and refined for civilian administration, creating a comprehensive system of psychological manipulation that extended throughout the Roman world. The confession describes how Roman administrators were trained to identify and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of different cultural groups. They studied local customs, religious beliefs, and social structures to understand how different populations could be most effectively controlled. This knowledge was used to create administrative policies that would make subject populations compliant without requiring expensive military force. For example, Marcus described how the Romans used religious manipulation to control conquered populations. They would identify the most important local deities and religious practices, then gradually modify them to serve Roman political purposes. Local gods would be reinterpreted as aspects of Roman deities, and religious festivals would be restructured to celebrate Roman achievements. This religious manipulation was combined with economic and social policies designed to create psychological dependence on Roman authority. The Romans would provide economic benefits to cooperative local leaders, while subtly undermining traditional social structures that might serve as sources of resistance. Over time, local populations would become psychologically dependent on Roman administration, even if they had initially resisted Roman conquest. The confession also reveals how the Romans used architecture and urban planning as tools of psychological control. Roman cities were designed to create specific psychological responses in their inhabitants. The layout of streets, the placement of public buildings, and the design of public spaces were all carefully planned to reinforce Roman authority and to make resistance seem impossible. Marcus described how Roman architects studied the psychological impact of different architectural styles and used this knowledge to create buildings that would inspire fear or compliance as needed. The massive scale of Roman public buildings, the geometric precision of Roman city planning, and the symbolic content of Roman art and sculpture were all designed to create psychological effects that would support Roman political control. The secret doctrine also included techniques for identifying and neutralizing potential sources of resistance before they could become dangerous. The Romans developed methods for monitoring public opinion, for identifying potential rebel leaders, and for preventing the formation of opposition movements. These methods were remarkably sophisticated for their time and anticipated many modern surveillance and control techniques. The resistance. Marcus's confession reveals that the Roman psychological warfare system, despite its sophistication, was not completely successful. There were individuals and groups throughout the Roman world who recognized what was happening and who tried to resist psychological manipulation. The confession describes a loose network of Roman soldiers, administrators, and civilians who were uncomfortable with the psychological warfare techniques being used by the empire. These people couldn't openly oppose the system without risking their lives, but they found subtle ways to resist and to protect potential victims of psychological manipulation. Marcus wrote about Roman officers who would deliberately provide inadequate intelligence for psychological warfare operations, or who would find ways to warn potential targets about planned psychological operations. He described administrators who would subtly sabotage psychological control policies, and civilians who would provide hidden support for people who were being targeted by Roman psychological warfare. The confession also reveals that some of Rome's enemies had begun to understand and counter Roman psychological warfare techniques. Marcus described campaigns where enemy leaders had successfully identified and neutralized Roman psychological operations, and where Roman forces had been forced to rely on conventional military tactics because their psychological warfare methods had been rendered ineffective. These instances of successful resistance to Roman psychological warfare were carefully studied by Roman military analysts who used them to refine and improve their methods. The secret doctrine was constantly being updated based on lessons learned from both successful and failed psychological operations. Marcus's confession suggests that the development of psychological warfare was not a one-sided process. As the Romans became more sophisticated in their psychological manipulation techniques, their enemies also became more sophisticated in their resistance methods. This created an arms race of psychological warfare that continued throughout the imperial period. The confession also reveals that resistance to psychological warfare often came from unexpected sources. Some of the most effective opponents of Roman psychological manipulation were people who had been trained in Roman methods, but who had turned against the system. Former Roman soldiers, administrators, and even some members of the Roman elite used their knowledge of Roman psychological warfare techniques to help others resist Roman control. The moral questions. Marcus's confession raises profound ethical questions about the use of psychological warfare that remain relevant today. His struggle with the moral implications of the secret doctrine reflects broader questions about the ethics of using psychological manipulation as a tool of military and political control. The confession reveals that even in the ancient world, there were people who recognized that psychological warfare raised serious moral questions. Marcus wasn't just troubled by the effectiveness of Roman psychological manipulation techniques. He was troubled by the fundamental question of whether it was right to use such methods, even in service of a cause that he believed was just. Marcus's moral crisis centered on the question of consent. The people who were targeted by Roman psychological warfare operations were ungiven the opportunity to make informed choices about their fate. They were manipulated into making decisions that served Roman interests, but they weren't told that they were being manipulated. Marcus felt that this violated basic principles of human dignity and autonomy. The confession also reveals Marcus's concerns about the effect of psychological warfare on the people who implemented it. He observed that soldiers who were trained to carry out psychological manipulation operations often became desensitized to human suffering and began to view other people as objects to be manipulated rather than as fellow human beings. Marcus worried that the systematic use of psychological warfare was corrupting Roman society itself. He felt that a civilization that was willing to use such methods against its enemies would eventually use them against its own people. The techniques that were developed for military campaigns were already being adapted for civilian administration, and Marcus feared that this trend would continue until no one in the Roman world would be free from psychological manipulation. The confession also raises questions about the responsibility of individuals who participate in psychological warfare operations. Marcus felt guilty about his role in implementing the secret doctrine, but he also recognized that he had been systematically trained and conditioned to carry out these operations without understanding their full implications. This raises the question of whether individuals can be held morally responsible for actions that they were psychologically conditioned to perform. Marcus's confession suggests that even people who are systematically trained to carry out psychological manipulation can maintain their moral agency and can choose to resist, but only if they are willing to pay a significant personal cost. The warning. Marcus's confession wasn't just a historical document, it was also a warning to future generations about the dangers of psychological warfare. Marcus hoped that by revealing the truth about the secret doctrine could help people understand how psychological manipulation works and how to resist it. Described in Marcus's confession have clear parallels with modern propaganda and psychological manipulation methods. The Romans' understanding of how to exploit human psychological vulnerabilities, how to create compliance without coercion, and how to make people police themselves all anticipate methods that are used by modern governments, corporations, and other organizations. Marcus's confession suggests that the development of psychological warfare as a tool of social control has much deeper historical roots than most people realize. The systematic study of human psychology for the purpose of manipulation and control is not a modern invention. It has been going on for at least 2,000 years. This has important implications for how we understand and respond to modern psychological manipulation. If the Romans could develop such sophisticated psychological control techniques without modern technology or scientific understanding, what capabilities do modern organizations have, and how are they being used? Marcus's confession also provides insights into how psychological warfare operations are typically organized and implemented. The compartmentalization of knowledge, the gradual conditioning of operatives, and the careful management of information all follow patterns that can be observed in modern psychological manipulation operations. Understanding these patterns can help people recognize when they are being targeted by psychological manipulation and can help them develop strategies for resistance. Marcus's confession suggests that the most effective resistance to psychological warfare comes from people who understand how these operations work and who are willing to expose the truth about them. The confession also emphasizes the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the face of institutional pressure to compromise them. Marcus's struggle with his conscience shows that individuals always have the choice to resist psychological manipulation, even when that resistance requires great personal sacrifice. Marcus's warning is particularly relevant in our current era of social media, targeted advertising, and sophisticated data analysis. The tools available for psychological manipulation are more powerful than ever, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Understanding how the Romans used psychological warfare 2,000 years ago can help us understand and resist modern psychological manipulation techniques. The cover-up continues. One of the most striking aspects of Marcus's confession is how successfully the truth about the secret doctrine was suppressed for nearly 2,000 years. Even after the confession was discovered in 1963, there were attempts to discredit or suppress its contents. This suggests that the use of psychological warfare as a tool of political and social control is still considered sensitive information by those in power. The initial academic response to Marcus's confession was skeptical, and some historians argue that the document was either a forgery or a work of fiction. While this skepticism was partly justified by the extraordinary nature of the claims made in the confession, it also reflected a reluctance to accept that ancient societies could have been capable of such sophisticated psychological manipulation. Even after the authenticity of the confession was established, there were attempts to minimize its significance. Some historians argued that the psychological warfare techniques described in the confession were isolated experiments rather than systematic programs. Others suggested that the techniques were not as effective as Marcus claimed, or that they were not widely used throughout the Roman Empire. These attempts to minimize the significance of Marcus's confession reflect a broader reluctance to acknowledge the extent to which psychological manipulation has been used throughout history as a tool of political and social control. Admitting that the Romans had developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques would require acknowledging that such techniques have been used by many other societies throughout history, including our own. The suppression of information about historical, psychological warfare operations serves the interests of modern organizations that use similar techniques. If people understood how psychological manipulation has been used throughout history, they might be more resistant to modern psychological manipulation techniques. Marcus's confession also reveals how information about psychological warfare operations is typically suppressed. The techniques used to hide the secret doctrine, compartmentalization of knowledge, classification of information, and elimination of evidence are still used today to suppress information about psychological manipulation operations. Understanding these suppression techniques can help people recognize when information is being deliberately hidden and can help them develop strategies for uncovering suppressed information. Marcus's confession shows that even the most carefully suppressed information can eventually be discovered and revealed, but only if people are willing to look for it and to preserve it when they find it. The human element throughout this story could be seen how individual courage and moral integrity can make a difference even in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure. Marcus's decision to speak out about the secret doctrine was not just a historical curiosity. It was an act of moral courage that has had a lasting impact on our understanding of history and of human nature. Marcus's confession shows that even in the most oppressive systems, individuals retain the capacity for moral choice. Marcus could have remained silent about the secret doctrine, and his silence would have been understandable given the personal risks involved in speaking out. But he chose to risk everything to preserve the truth for future generations. The confession also reveals the importance of finding allies and support systems when resisting institutional pressure. Marcus's relationship with the scribe Lucius was crucial to the preservation of his confession. Without Lucius's help, Marcus's revelations would never have survived to be discovered by modern archaeologists. This suggests that resistance to psychological manipulation and institutional corruption is most effective when it involves networks of people who support each other and who are willing to take risks to preserve and transmit important information. Individual acts of courage are important, but they are most effective when they are part of broader movements for truth and justice. Marcus's confession also shows the importance of documentation and evidence in exposing institutional wrongdoing. Marcus didn't just speak out about the secret doctrine, He carefully documented his experiences and preserved evidence that could be used to verify his claims. This documentation was crucial to establishing the credibility of his confession and to ensuring that his revelations would have lasting impact. The story of Marcus's confession also demonstrates the importance of historical perspective in understanding current events. By revealing the truth about Roman psychological warfare techniques, Marcus's confession helps us understand how similar techniques are used today. This historical perspective is crucial for recognizing and resisting modern psychological manipulation operations. Finally, Marcus's confession shows that the truth has a way of eventually coming to light, even when powerful institutions try to suppress it. Marcus's revelations remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years, but they were eventually discovered and have had a significant impact on our understanding of history and of human nature. The final revelation. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to step back and consider what Marcus's confession really tells us about history, about human nature, and about the world we live in today. The discovery of the secret doctrine has forced us to reconsider many of our assumptions about the past and about the present. Marcus's confession reveals that the development of psychological warfare as a tool of social and political control has much deeper historical roots than most people realize. The systematic study of human psychology for the purpose of manipulation and control is not a modern invention. It has been going on for at least 2,000 years, and probably much longer. This has important implications for how we understand the nature of political power and social control. The traditional view of political power as being based primarily on physical force or economic incentives is incomplete. Political power has always been based partly on psychological manipulation, and the most successful political systems have been those that have mastered the art of psychological control. Marcus's confession also reveals the moral costs of psychological warfare, both for its victims and for the people who implement it. The systematic use of psychological manipulation techniques corrupts both the manipulators and the manipulated, creating a society where authentic human relationships become difficult or impossible. The confession shows that resistance to psychological manipulation is possible, but it requires great personal courage and often involves significant personal sacrifice. Marcus's decision to speak out about the secret doctrine cost him his peace of mind and probably contributed to his death. But it also preserved important information that has helped future generations understand the nature of psychological warfare. Marcus's story also demonstrates the importance of individual moral agency in the face of institutional pressure. Even when people are systematically trained and conditioned to carry out psychological manipulation operations, they retain the capacity for moral choice. They can choose to resist, even when resistance is dangerous and difficult. The confession reveals that the most effective resistance to psychological warfare comes from people who understand how these operations work and who are willing to expose the truth about them. Marcus's detailed documentation of Roman psychological warfare techniques has helped modern researchers understand how such operations are typically organized and implemented. Finally, Marcus's confession shows that the truth has a way of eventually coming to light, even when powerful institutions try to suppress it. This gives us hope that other suppressed truths will eventually be revealed, and it encourages us to continue looking for evidence of institutional wrongdoing and to preserve that evidence when we find it. It's the modern parallel. Marcus's confession about the Roman secret doctrine forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own time. If the Romans could develop such sophisticated psychological warfare techniques 2,000 years ago, what similar programs exist today? Are modern governments, corporations, and other organizations using psychological manipulation to control behavior and shape public opinion? The techniques described in Marcus's confession have clear parallels with modern propaganda and psychological manipulation methods. The systematic study of human psychological vulnerabilities, the compartmentalization of knowledge among operatives, and the careful management of information all follow patterns that can be observed in contemporary psychological manipulation operations. Social media platforms, for example, use sophisticated algorithms to shape what information people see and how they respond to it. These algorithms are designed to maximize engagement and to keep people using the platforms, but they also have the effect of shaping public opinion and political behavior. The psychological principles underlying these systems are remarkably similar to those described in the Roman secret doctrine. Modern advertising and marketing also use psychological manipulation techniques that would have been familiar to Roman psychological warfare specialists. Systematic study of consumer psychology, the use of emotional manipulation to influence purchasing decisions, and the creation of artificial needs and desires all follow patterns that were established in ancient psychological warfare operations. Political campaigns and governmental propaganda operations also use techniques that parallel those described in Marcus's confession. The systematic manipulation of public opinion, the use of carefully crafted messages to influence voter behavior, and the creation of artificial crises to justify political actions all have their roots in ancient psychological warfare methods. The confession also reveals how psychological manipulation operations are typically organized and how they can be recognized. The compartmentalization of knowledge, the gradual conditioning of operatives, and the careful suppression of information about the operations are all patterns that can be observed in modern psychological manipulation campaigns. Understanding these patterns can help people recognize they are being targeted by psychological manipulation and can help them develop strategies for resistance. Marcus's confession suggests that the most effective resistance comes from people who understand how these operations work and who are willing to expose the truth about them. The confession also emphasizes the importance of maintaining individual moral agency in the face of institutional pressure. Just as Marcus had to choose between loyalty to Rome and loyalty to his own moral principles, modern individuals often face similar choices between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. The call to action. Marcus's confession wasn't just a historical document, okay? It was also a call to action for future generations. Marcus hoped that by revealing the truth about the secret doctrine, he could help people understand how psychological manipulation works and how to resist it. His message is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The first step in resisting psychological manipulation is education. People need to understand how psychological warfare operations work, how they are organized, and how they can be recognized. Marcus's confession provides valuable insights into these questions, but it is important to study modern psychological manipulation techniques as well. The second step is developing critical thinking skills. People who are targeted by psychological manipulation operations need to be able to analyze information critically, to recognize when they are being manipulated, and to make informed decisions based on accurate information rather than on emotional manipulation. The third step is building support networks. Marcus's confession shows that resistance to psychological manipulation is most effective when it involves networks of people who support each other and who are willing to take risks to preserve and transmit important information. Individual acts of courage are important, but they are most effective when they are part of broader movements for truth and justice. The fourth step is documentation and preservation of evidence. Marcus's careful documentation of his experiences was crucial too. The preservation of his confession and to its eventual impact on our understanding of history. People who witness institutional wrongdoing need to document what they see and to preserve that documentation in ways that will ensure its eventual discovery. The fifth step is speaking out when the opportunity arises. Marcus waited until he was dying to make his confession, but he might have had more impact if he had spoken out earlier. People who have evidence of institutional wrongdoing need to find ways to reveal that evidence, even when doing so involves personal risk. The sixth step is supporting others who are willing to speak out. Marcus's relationship with the scribe, Lucius, was crucial to the preservation of his confession. People who are not in a position to speak out themselves can still support others who are willing to take risks to reveal the truth. Finally, it is important to remember that resistance to psychological manipulation is a long-term process that requires patience and persistence. Marcus's confession remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years before it was discovered, but it eventually had a significant impact on our understanding of history and of human nature. The truth has a way of eventually coming to light, but only if people are willing to preserve it and to keep looking for it. The lasting impact. Marcus's confession has already had a profound impact on our understanding of Roman history and the nature of political power, but its influence is likely to continue growing as more people become aware of its contents and its implications. The story of Marcus's moral courage and his decision to speak out about the secret doctrine provides a powerful example of how individual actions can have lasting historical impact. The confession has influenced modern military training and ethics by highlighting the importance of moral education and the responsibility of individual soldiers to understand the ethical implications of their actions. Military leaders have begun to pay more attention to the psychological impact of military operations and to the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the pursuit of military objectives. The confession has also influenced modern political and social movements by providing insights into how psychological manipulation operations work and how they can be resisted. Activists and reformers have used Marcus's example to inspire others to speak out about institutional wrongdoing and to preserve evidence of such wrongdoing for future generations. The story of Marcus's confession has also had a significant impact on popular culture, inspiring novels, films, and other artistic works that explore themes of moral courage, institutional corruption, and the struggle between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. These cultural works have helped to spread awareness of the story and its implications to a broader audience. The Confession has also influenced academic research in fields ranging from history and archaeology to psychology and political science. Researchers have used Marcus's insights to better understand how psychological manipulation operations work and how they can be detected and countered. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus's Confession has provided hope to people who are struggling with their own moral dilemmas in the face of institutional pressure. The story shows that even in the most oppressive circumstances, keen individuals retain the capacity for moral choice and can make a difference by speaking out about wrongdoing. The Confession also provides a historical perspective that helps people understand that the struggle between individual conscience and institutional power is not a modern phenomenon, but has been going on throughout human history. This perspective can help people understand that their own moral struggles are part of a larger human story, and that their individual actions can have historical significance. Marcus's story also demonstrates that the truth has a way of eventually coming to light, even when powerful institutions try to suppress it. This provides hope that other suppressed truths will eventually be revealed and encourages people to continue looking for evidence of institutional wrongdoing and to preserve that evidence when they find it. The final word. As we conclude this remarkable story, it's worth reflecting on what Marcus Flavius Tertius ultimately achieved through his decision to speak out about the secret doctrine. His confession has not only changed our understanding of Roman history, but has also provided insights into the nature of power, the importance of moral courage, and the enduring human capacity for both good and evil. Marcus's legacy is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, his confession has revealed the sophisticated and morally troubling nature of Roman psychological warfare, forcing us to reconsider many of our assumptions about the ancient world and about the nature of civilized society. On the other hand, its moral courage in speaking out about these practices has provided an inspiring example of individual integrity in the face of institutional pressure. The confession has also demonstrated the importance of preserving truth for future generations, even when that truth is uncomfortable or dangerous. Marcus's decision to document his experiences and to arrange for his confession to be preserved has ensured that his insights would not be lost to history. His story shows that individual actions can have lasting impact, even when their effects are not immediately apparent. Marcus's confession has also highlighted the ongoing relevance of ancient history to contemporary problems. The psychological warfare techniques described in his confession have clear parallels with modern propaganda and manipulation methods, suggesting that the struggles between individual conscience and institutional power are timeless aspects of the human condition. The story of Marcus's confession also provides hope that truth and justice will ultimately prevail, even in the face of powerful attempts to suppress them. Marcus's revelations remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years, but they were eventually discovered and have had a significant impact on our understanding of history and of human nature. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus's confession reminds us that we all have the capacity for moral choice, even in the most difficult circumstances. Marcus could have remained silent about the secret doctrine, and his silence would have been understandable given the personal risks involved in speaking out. But he chose to risk everything to preserve the truth for future generations. This choice required tremendous personal courage, but it also reflected Marcus's understanding that individual moral integrity is more important than institutional loyalty or personal safety. His example challenges us to consider our own moral choices and to ask ourselves whether we would be willing to make similar sacrifices to preserve truth and justice. Marcus's story also reminds us that we are all part of a larger human story that extends far beyond our individual lives. The the moral choices we make today will have implications for future generations. Just as the moral choices made by people in the past have shaped the world we live in today. The confession of Marcus Flavius Tertius stands as a testament to the enduring power of individual moral courage and to the importance of preserving truth for future generations. His words, written in the final hours of his life nearly 2,000 years ago, continue to inspire and challenge us today. They remind us that the struggle between good and evil, between truth and falsehood, between individual conscience and institutional power, is an eternal aspect of the human condition. In the end, Marcus's greatest achievement may not have been exposing the Roman secret doctrines, but rather demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals retain the capacity for moral choice and can make a difference by choosing to stand up for truth and justice. His legacy challenges us to find our own courage to speak out about wrongdoing, to preserve truth for future generations, and to never stop fighting for what is right, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Marcus Flavius Tertius died nearly 2,000 years ago, but his words and his example live on. His confession reminds us that we are all part of a larger human story, and that our individual choices matter more than we might imagine. In a world where psychological manipulation and institutional corruption continue to threaten human dignity and freedom, Marcus's message is more relevant than ever. The truth will eventually come to light, but only if we have the courage to preserve it and the wisdom to learn from it. The Roman soldier's final words have indeed exposed a 2,000-year-old secret, but more importantly, they have revealed timeless truths about human nature, moral courage, and the enduring power of individual conscience. Marcus's confession is not just a historical document. It is a call to action for all of us to stand up for truth and justice, no matter what the cost. His legacy challenges us to be worthy of the sacrifice he made and to continue the work he began, preserving truth for future generations and fighting against the forces of manipulation and corruption that threaten human dignity and freedom. In the words that Marcus spoke to the scribe Lucius in those final hours, someone must know. Now we know. The question is, what will we do with this knowledge? How will we honor Marcus's sacrifice? How will we ensure that the truth he preserved continues to illuminate the darkness and inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, truth over lies, and justice over power? The answer to these questions lies not in the past, but in the choices we make today and tomorrow. Marcus Flavius Tertius has shown us the way. Now it is up to us to follow his example and to ensure that his sacrifice was not in vain. The Roman soldier's final words have changed everything. The question is, will we let them change us?